Not going to lie, the title might have been a bit ambitious. I think might be a bit more Wales in there than Ireland and England, but if you all bear with me, there's dragons, so, not in the paper, but in Wales. So, yeah, it's cool. Anywho, in the late 1920s, the future 8th Marquess of Londonderry wrote to a friend about his decision to go into politics. Quote, "It is the only job that gives one the chance of taking an intelligent interest in the various properties my father owns. We have mines at Seaham, agricultural interests here and in Ireland, and an estate in Wales. If one has property like this, one has no real claim to it unless one takes a proper interest in it, and I feel that an attempt in a political direction is the only way to do this, and at the same time pretend one is doing something." So the Vane Tempest Stuart family, Marquesses and Marchionesses of Londonderry, are an influential, if often controversial, family in the history of Ireland, Britain, and wider Europe. Very, very quickly. So the Stuarts initially settled in Ireland as part of the 17th century plantation of Ulster. Their financial fortunes improved following Alexander Stuart's marriage with Mary Cohen in 1737, who had inherited her brother's East India-derived fortune. They're not shown. First Marquess, Robert Stuart, strengthened his family's political position through marriages to Frances Seymour Conway. Oh my God, the paper is sticky. Together, yeah. Daughter of the Marquess of Hereford, and Frances Pratt, the daughter of Charles Pratt, 1st Earl Camden. Robert held various governmental and administrative positions in Ireland and became Baron Londonderry in 1789, Viscount Castlereagh in 1795, Earl of Londonderry in 1796, and finally Marquess of Londonderry in 1816. Last title is in recognition of the political achievements and activities of his eldest son by his first marriage. Number 2 on there, best known by his title, Castlereagh, also Robert Stuart. He further elevates the family's political importance as well as its infamy. Here lie the bones of Castlereagh, stop, traveller, and piss, in the immortal words of Lord Byron. For his role he plays in orchestrating the 1801 Act of Union, as well as his general opposition to parliamentary reform and willingness to suspend civil liberties in the early 19th century. His half-brother, Charles, 3rd Marquess, and he were both present at the Congress of Vienna because the family was in there. Charles Vane, nee Stuart, number 3, notable soldier and diplomat in the Peninsular and Napoleonic Wars before becoming a conservative politician and industrialist. After the death of his first wife, Catherine Blythe, mother of the 4th Marquess, he marries the young heiress and future political socialite and female industrialist Frances Anne Vane Tempest. Her estates and fortune were turned to sizable and wealthy industrial ventures, particularly coal in County Durham, including the purchase and construction of a port at Seaham. Charles and Frances Anne's eldest son, George Henry Vane Tempest, married the Welsh heiress Mary Cornelia Edwards of Plasmacunlleth, who brought her own land and industrial interest in the Welsh counties of Montgomery and Merioneth. Their son, the 6th Marquess, Charles Vane Tempest Stuart, it just keeps getting longer and longer, was a conservative and unionist politician who served as Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, 1886 to 1889. His wife, Teresa, was another prominent political socialite, as was, as we have just heard, their daughter-in-law, Edith, while their son, Charles Vane Tempest Stuart, the 7th Marquess, was also a conservative politician in both Westminster and Belfast, but is mostly remembered today for his efforts to reach a understanding with Nazi Germany. So, yeah, mixed bag there. Over the course of the 19th century, therefore, the Londonderry's power and property evolved from a moderate estate in the north of Ireland to become a vast multinational estate with lucrative industrial holdings which spanned 3 nations, and they came to wield political power and influence both directly and through networks of social and familiar connections. Their situation was remarkable, but certainly not unique. And his great landowners of Great Britain and Ireland, which ran to 4 editions between 1876 and 1883, John Bateman lists the counties in which each of the families held lands and their acreages. And you can see Londonderry is up there, and I don't know if you can read it, but it's pretty obscene. 50,323 acres worth £100,118 annual. That was kind of the zenith of their property holdings. This is during the time of the fifth Marcus. But yeah, it's a lot of money. But they were not unique, and many families held lands in multiple counties, if not, at this point, multiple nations or countries. The transformation of Welsh estates across the 18th century, as especially shown by Philip Jenkins's work on Glamorgan, has been characterized by a failure of some notable families in the male line and consequent marriage of heiresses to and purchases of estates by newcomers. Examined and found wanting by Anthony Malcolmson within Irish context, but it's interesting that he notes two exceptions where marriages to eligible heiresses appear to have been motivated by personal gain and profit. The marriage of Wyndham Quin and of Adair and Caroline Wyndham of Dunraven, they bonded over the fact that his first name was almost the same as her surname, obviously. And Charles Stewart and Frances Anne Van Tempest, on both of which couples later. On the latter point of acquisition, Lowry and Rees has noted that many of those who bought Welsh estates in the second half of the 18th century and first half of the 19th century, quote, came from England and Scotland, suggesting that Wales may have been seen as a more affordable place to establish oneself. And of course, as Linda Colley has discussed, this may be a pan-British thing at the time and contributed to the idea of kind of a British socioeconomic elite in the 18th century and afterwards. This long-standing replacement of estate holders with new money and new husbands has contributed to the characterization of 18th and 19th century Welsh landowners as increasingly anglicized and detached from the common Welsh men and women living and working on their estates. However, as both Rees and Sean Evans have shown, new landowners did seek to cement their place within local society and culture through activities such as undertaking local and county administrative roles, encouraging and engaging in antiquarian research, and patronizing and participating in cultural activities such as Eisteddfodau. Such activities could and did amount to expressions of local and national Welsh identity. An interesting example of this is shown by Edward Ab Adam of Middleton Hall, Carmarthenshire. His father bought Middleton Hall with some slavery-derived money from William Paxton, who had in turn bought it with East India-derived money. And it's now the National Botanical Garden for Wales, so we'll just go full circle back to that panel a while ago. He changed the family name from Adams to Ab Adams in an imitation of the Welsh patronymics. Owners of multinational estates also needed to rise to this challenge of embedding themselves within local and national cultures within which their various parts of their estates were situated, requiring a careful balancing act between the identities in order to leverage the different benefits derived therefrom. The Wyndham Quims of Dunraven and Adair are an interesting case in point. In their examination of the life and identities of Caroline Wyndham Quim, Odette Clark has discussed how Caroline's Welsh identity and interests were subsumed by the Irish focus of her husband's family, effectively rendering them as something close to absentee landlords in Glamorgan and Gloucestershire. This included exploiting the material wealth of the Welsh estate to construct Adair House in Ireland without borrowing, selling, or leaving a debt, as is inscribed on the house itself. Much of the ornamentation in the house references the Wyndham rather than the Irish Quin lineage, but in a way which reflected the family's English rather than Welsh roots. However, when it came time for their son, the future third Marcus Edwin, to seek a parliamentary seat in Wales, he took up residence at Dunraven, and Caroline leveraged local connections to earn his seat. As Clark notes, quote, it would have been hard enough to fight coming elections as a Tory without the added handicap of being seen as other than Welsh. And you can look at an example about a century earlier, Valentin Morris of Piercefield, who were trying to fight a Welsh seat as being perceived as something other than Welsh. You know, his family had very strong Welsh West Indian connection, origins of wealth, all of it. And the descriptions of him in the press were not words that we use anymore. When he tried to take on the Morgans or Tredegar. It didn't go well for him. Edwin's son, the fourth Marquess of Dunraven, consequently spent most of his childhood at Dunraven and published a history of the castle, but still described himself in his autobiography as an Irishman born and bred. The acquisition of states in multiple nations was not simple and straightforward process. The construction of the Londonderrys' own multinational estate shows that it required negotiation between the emphasis given to activities in different geographical areas and the nature of marriage settlements and remainder inheritances. Indeed, at each stage, the estate almost came together contrary to intentions through the failure to effectively establish cadet branches. Prior to his half-brother Castlereagh's suicide, Charles Stuart was elevated to his own title of Baron Stuart of Ballyloughlin in 1814, and on his marriage in 1819, he adopted his wife's surname of Vane, further signaling his desire to establish a separate line. Following Robert's death, Charles was created Earl Vane and Viscount Seaham, with remainder to his eldest son by Francis and George Henry. As Malcolmson notes, the activities and attitudes of Charles towards the Durham estate, quote, conformed to the usual pattern of cadet inheritance. Quote, the Lord Londonderry's son by a previous marriage was due to inherit his own marquisate of Londonderry and his own estates in Ireland. This separation of the two portfolios applied to the present as well as the future. The incomes of the Stuart and the Vane Tempest estates were kept distinct, and there was no subsidizing of County Down by County Durham. Accordingly, on the third Marquess's death, Frances Anne took over the management of the industrial ventures in County Durham, leaving them to her son, Earl Vane, later the fifth Marquess, rather than having them pass to her stepson, the fourth Marquess. However, this does not mean that Charles was necessarily neglectful of his Irish holdings, as the correspondence with the estate agents in County Down and the renovations which he made to Mount Stuart show, albeit his loaded lack of liberality and sympathy for victims of the Great Famine, his staunch conservatism over the land question causing a rift with his own son, the future fourth Marquess. His staunch conservative also manifested in opposition to labor reform with regard to his English collieries, and the fact that he contemplated importing Irish strikebreakers in 1845 may show that simply because the finances of the two estates were kept separate, they still offered multinational solutions to local problems. A similar pattern was seen in Wales. The marriage settlement to the sixth Marquess, Charles Vane Tempest, was the occasion of a heated correspondence between father and son, wherein George Henry expressed in no uncertain terms that Charles's siblings were not to be, quote, left out in the cold. His mother's Welsh estate was to be left to his younger brother Henry, but owing to Henry's premature death, was retained by Mary Cornelia before passing to the youngest brother Herbert. It was only on Herbert's death in the Abermule train disaster of 1921 that the estate passed to the seventh Marquess and just became a whole once again. The example of the Welsh estate presents interesting nexuses of local, national and transnational identities. The Plasmacunlleth and Garth estates were largely accumulated by Mary Cornelia's grandfather and father, both John Edwards. John Edwards the Younger was a Liberal politician and improving landlord. He was created Baronet of Garth in 1838 for his services to the Liberal government, choosing the overtly Welsh motto, rooted in liberal, romantic, Iolo Morgannwg-esque culture of the early 19th century Wales, a gwyrdd yn erbyn y byd. That the family was consciously and proudly Welsh is further illustrated by the story that George Henry was prompted to change his family name from Vane to Vane Tempest, thus emphasizing the descent from two notable English lineages in response to his wife's strong pride in her own descent from Llywelyn Fawr. This anecdote is amusing, but it belies the fact that George Henry was, from his birth, consciously a part of a pan-European elite. Born while his father was on diplomatic service in Europe, he was christened George Henry Robert Charles after the king, his two grandfathers, and his father, respectively. At his christening, which occurred at the British Embassy in Vienna, he was sponsored by George IV, his uncle Castlereagh, and Lady Antrim, for whom his parents and Prince Clemens von Metternich stood proxy. In 1867, he served as envoy extraordinary to Russia to invest Tsar Alexander II with the Order of the Garter, a job he was likely chosen for because of his mother's famously close friendship with Alexander I, which that was not an awkward visit, was it? On which occasion he was awarded the Grand Cross of the Russian Order of St. Alexander Nevsky. Despite her background as the heiress of a Welsh estate in a small mid-Wales town whose grandfather had been a solicitor, Mary Cornelia appears to have been very much up to the task of adopting the identity of Lady Londonderry, with all the wealth and international importance which that signified. And just a note, there's also a portrait of her in Mount Stuart, which really is like very Lady Londonderry-esque. She's staring into your soul in that one. But just a note on the statue, her impact on the local area in Machynlleth is such that she is one of the only women in Wales to have a statue. So most of the rest of them were created post to 2021 thanks to like a movement. But yeah, this is a rare historic example of a statue of a Welsh woman in Wales in a public space. Yeah, okay. So the family entertained British and foreign dignitaries such as the Prince Christian and Princess Helena of Schleswig-Holstein in 1870 and Chancellor Otto von Bismarck in 1883. The plasma itself was also host to two royal visits in 1896 and 1911. In 1877, George Henry and Mary Cornelia were invited to a dinner given by Disraeli, another close friend of Francis Anne's, but I don't think in the same way. Not to be outshone by Lady Ignatieff, who had a reputation for grandeur, Disraeli noted that Lady Londonderry staggered under the jewels of the three united families of Stuart and Vane, and Londonderry, on her right arm set in diamonds, the portrait of the Emperor of Russia, an imperial present to Francis Anne. George Henry and Mary Cornelia, however, settled and largely focused their activities on her estate in Wales, becoming entrenched in the local community and occupying themselves with local benefices and urban improvement. Indeed, the family's biographer, H. Montgomery Hyde, describes the fifth Marquess as, quote, perhaps the least conspicuous member of the family, which, considering some other family members, is not totally a bad thing. George Henry and Mary Cornelia, along with the Dowager Lady Edwards, regularly distributed food and blankets to the poor from Vane Hall near the Place. The birth of the first son, Charles, was marked by the foundation of the town's first school, which later became its first hospital. And a few years later, Mary Cornelia also established almhouses next door. They're also instrumental in the coming of the railway to Machynlleth. The building work which the Londonderrys undertook occasionally referenced their other properties, emphasizing that these localities were linked through the estates. One of the cottages connected to the Van lead mines is called Seaham, while there's a Magalona Street in Seaham. Incidentally, Magalona, which is the Latin for Machynlleth, crops up several times in connection to the family, including one of the middle names of one of the seventh Marquess's daughters, who was born before he got the estate. So. In addition to the building work in the town, the Place of the Grounds was also turned over to local celebrations and events, and the family also participated in and patronized prizes at local Eisteddfodau. George Henry was also an active local administrator, and his very last act on earth was to attend the local petty sessions, after which he suffered a stroke and died at the Place. He was buried in the churchyard of St. Peter's alongside other members of his family. The memorials to his death, including 3 stained glass windows, I think I counted and it was like 6 out of the 11 windows in there are to the family in like 2 generations, so a lot. They include, one was donated by the CM volunteers, and the other 2 by his Welsh friends and neighbors. So an interesting noting of the kind of national identity of friends and neighbors in that, which situate him within Machynlleth, but show that he maintained close links to his industrial estates in the northeast England. Indeed, the collected condolences in professional and civic bodies and societies, as well as his tenancy, show an outpouring of sympathy from County Durham, with only a few letters from Ireland and Wales, albeit the latter probably were expressed locally. George Henry was MP for Durham from 1847 until his elevation to the Lords, served in several local relevance, including founding the CM Artillery Volunteer Brigade, and was Lord Lieutenant of the county from 1880. With regard to his Irish connections, however, these are very much less well represented, albeit Disraeli did persuade the Queen to confirm the Order of St. Patrick's on him in memory of his mother. Arguably the most notable memorial to the Londonderrys in Machynlleth is the town clock, which is erected as a coming-of-age present to Charles, the future 6th Marquess. It's a local tribute, and the celebrations surrounding it were very much a local affair and had a local character. So at the laying of the foundation stone in June 1874, the chairman of the committee assured the assembled crowd of thousands, the current population is like 2,000, that he, quote, would not be tempted, even if time permitted, to travel over ground associated with the historic name of Charles inherits, i.e. Londonderry / Castlereagh, and the fame of his predecessors, confining himself to, quote, less conspicuous, but not to us less interesting topics connected with local annals. We regard his lordship as having in his veins Welsh blood as pure as that of the Queen herself. As Welsh as his blood may have been, the sixth Marquess' work and identity were very much linked with Ireland. He was elected MP for County Down in 1878, and in 1886, this apparent Welshman was appointed Lord Lieutenant of Ireland on the basis of his status and identity as an Irish landlord. He accompanied to Ireland by his brothers, his youngest brother Herbert serving as his, principal aide-de-camp. Herbert also had attachments to Ireland, having inherited Francis Anne's Gowran Tower estate in County Antrim alongside the Place, and a memorial window to him in St. Peter's contains both Saints Patrick and Asaph, which is a great visual marker of the two national identities there. Charles would remain associated with Ireland throughout his life and career, notable for, as appropriate for Castlereagh's great-nephew, his unionism. Still, in 1905, while president of the Board of Education, which had recently recommended that the use of school slates be discontinued, he deliberately referred back to his Welsh roots in addressing a delegation from Carnarvonshire to understand that he understood the concerns. So the members of the Londonderry family, like other families with multinational estates, laid claim to multiple identities and associations, which they actively cultivated and emphasized depending on the context and need. Of course, holding multiple national identities and supranational identities was not the preserve of the landed entitled. In Welsh context, people of all social classes and orders in the 18th and 19th centuries were conscious and proud of being British in both the ancient and modern senses. As kind of Bethan Jenkins has discussed, that kind of Britanniaeth, Britain Dod, Cymraeg Dod, the bits that compete and contrast in the period. Nor was Welshness, Irishness, Englishness, or Scottishness held simply through the ownership of lands and titles. For all his associations and activities within social and cultural life in Mid-Wales, George Henry was never made pretensions at being Welsh, nor is there any evidence that he was viewed as being Welsh. He did, however, have a local identity and a well-regarded central place within the local community with which he interacted. Moreover, his family was seen as Welsh, including his eldest son, who, embarking on his own career in estate, adopted the Irish identity to which he also held claim. Alongside this local and national, however, the Londonderrys' titles, wealth, and connections also gave them a unique identity tied to their family itself, which is more international, if not supranational in character. Although, last paper, the family's success in meeting with political familia and local obligations and expectations, in a large part, depended on their ability to successfully navigate between these different worlds, nations, and localities. Thank you very much.